지금부터 2020 글로벌
So from now on, we are going to start the session on international cooperation for Korea New Deal to respond to the post-COVID-19 world. I'd like to invite Director Hoyer Kwon from Korea Information Society Development Institute for the opening remarks. Good afternoon. I am Hoyer Kwon from Korea Information Society Development Institute. This is the 9th session of today's Global Korea Convention 2020. In this session, we are going to talk about Korean New Deal and international cooperation. Welcome all to this session, and thank you for attending this session from home and abroad, on-site and online. Despite the challenging circumstances of COVID-19, still the Global Korea Convention 2020 was put together to establish Korea's role in leading countries and to contribute to the global peace, prosperity, and sustainable development. And I'd like to congratulate Director Sung Kyung-yoon on the successful opening of the convention. The COVID-19 situation brought about severe economic downturn and also accelerating economic polarization around the world. Nevertheless, the Korean government announced the Korean New Deal Comprehensive Plan last July to deal with this issue. Under the Korean New Deal, budget investment and institutional improvement will aim to bring about digital transformation and innovation across the economy. Digital New Deal and Green New Deal are the two main pillars of the Korean New Deal. And also, we are going to strengthen safety net for the vulnerable people. Many countries, including Korea, emphasize the importance of Green New Deal and announce carbon neutrality by 2050 as a national goal. And this trend is going to be strengthened further by the Bidenomics pursued by the U.S. President-elect Biden, who pursues a new growth model by investing in clean energy. Not just the government, the private sectors are recognizing the importance of green revolution as well. And also, many people are pursuing digital strategy as well. However, this transformation into digital economy is actually widening digital gap between developed countries and developing countries. And ICT-based ODA, digital ODA strategy and pursuing sustainable development goals are important efforts to overcome such digital divide. And Korea and other advanced nations and international organizations are working hard to narrow the digital gap. In today's session, we are going to talk about Korean New Deal and other policy cases from overseas countries. And we are going to think about ways to pursue international cooperation and development with this digital New Deal framework. I'd like to thank all the presenters, experts, and discussants who are going to generously share their insights and information with us. In concluding, I hope that this session will be a forum for various presentations and discussions for the Korean New Deal, and I hope this will be a starting point for an exciting journey towards a new connection and new storytelling for everyone participating on-site and online. Thank you.
네, 원장님
Thank you very much, President Kwon, for your warm opening speech. Now, I would like to invite the first presenter, Dr. Kyu-pan Kim, Senior Research Fellow, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, who's going to deliver the key policy cases that we can benchmark for Korean New Deal. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Kyu-pan Kim from Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. It is my great honor to make a presentation at the Global Korea Convention 2020, and I am going to talk about the policies we can refer to when it comes to New Deal initiatives. If we think about New Deal, in the 1930s, there was the New Deal policy instituted by the former President Roosevelt. But the New Deal initiatives that we see across the world today are generally divided into two. One area is in the digital area. So there are New Deal policies that are focusing on digital technologies. And then there is another set of New Deal approaches in the green and environment sector. So let me take a look at the digital New Deal in key economies. Countries or regions that are leading the digital New Deal initiatives are, I think, first and foremost, EU, and then there is the United States and China. First, I would like to talk about the digital New Deal policies of the European Union. Digital New Deal is being talked about recently, but before this term came into use, we used to talk about digital transformation or digital economy. So, it was more along the lines of the new digital industries that have emerged and that are very different from the brick and mortar industries of the traditional economy. And so since 2010, many countries have been talking about the data economy or the digital economy, and there has been a lot of competition across the world. And I think the Digital New Deal is an extension of this competition over the digital economy. And EU, I don't know, maybe this is by coincidence, but the European Commission announced the Digital New Deal policy. And if we look at the Digital New Deal strategy put forth by the EU, we can take some reflections which can help us help us create our own framework of the New Deal policies. And the Digital New Deal that EU has designed identifies 8 key focal areas. And these 8 areas include AI, first and foremost, and of course there is the online platform. And of course the government can provide investment and support for further investment. And also the government can potentially create legislations that can deal with the ethical issues surrounding artificial intelligence. And on the online platform side, there are applications and platform companies, and there's a lot of competition. So how are we going to deal with that competition in the online platform? I think that's part of this European New Deal. And third key area of this New Deal is the European data strategy. So EU is a single market, and they want also to create a single data market. And they want to protect personal information on the one hand, while also promoting easier and more effective use of the data for economic development. And also there is cyber security. And on this front, EU is thinking about how to co-work with the private sector to ensure cyber security. And fifth, this is the European industry strategy. The European industrial strategy is not just about the digital New Deal, because they also cover the Green New Deal. So on the one hand, this industrial strategy is promoting the economic side of things, but also protecting the environment. But, although there's a focus about digital, at the end of the day, there are people involved in developing the technologies and running the systems and whatnot. So the EU is also very much focused on nurturing talented people with digital expertise. And seventh area of focus is the high-performance computing. And finally, connectivity. Well, depending on the person who's using this, connectivity can be defined in many ways. But in the EU Digital New Deal, they're talking about establishing a 5G network connectivity. Now, EU's Digital New Deal, of course, provides investment, but at the same time, a large part of it is how to create the right kind of legislative environment to, guide and govern the market. Now, secondly, there is the Digital New Deal policies put forth by the U.S. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution, and there's digital transformation. And of course, U.S. is at the forefront of a lot of the innovations around digital transformation. We talk about GAFA, these four companies, and they're really leading the global digital market. And if we look at the federal level government policies in the U.S., it's very market-centric. And compared to the EU, the U.S. is less likely to intervene actively in the market itself. And the United States is focused on laying out the 5G network and also to ensure broadband infrastructure, which will serve as the basis for further developing the digital sector. President-elect Biden, of course, will be entering office soon, and his campaign pledge does not really emphasize the digital New Deal in and of itself. As you know, Biden was focused on the political situation in the United States itself, and he was also very much focused on the environmental issues. And he is likely to focus on establishing digital infrastructure, which was also a key focus for the Trump administration. Now, China Japan and Korea seem to have some commonalities when it comes to the New Deal policies. China, in May this year, announced a new infrastructure plan at the National People's Congress. And it also had identified 7 key focal areas, similar to the EU, but China has a different approach when it comes to how to finance these initiatives to promote the new infrastructures. And they have a key focus on the financing aspect of it, which is kind of different from EU's Digital New Deal plan. So let me now move on to Green New Deal. And I've identified EU and the United States as the only key players in the Green New Deal sector which we can benchmark. So there is the goal to achieve net zero emission by 2050. If we look at the graph, it's the United States and China are not included actually in this graph. Because the European countries are on the right, which really have set forth the net zero emissions goal by 2050. And then if you move towards the left of the graph, you see at the very end, at the very left end, there is Korea. So if you look at this graph, it is very important that your commitments are not just declared, but they are actually followed, and it leads to a consensus amongst the people and the private sector. And ultimately, there needs to be some sort of legislation that has binding force, and there needs to be a more strong commitment on achieving the goals. And in that sense, the European countries are at the forefront of this effort. But I would like to emphasize that the essence of Green New Deal is the green sector in which the government needs to invest. And not only that, the government wants also to grow the number of jobs. And it is very difficult to achieve a consensus that such Green New Deals can actually lead to increase in jobs. And according to an IEA Sustainable Recovery Plan, it can actually lead to significant creation of jobs. So when it comes to the Green New Deal, there are a lot of areas where the government can invest. But at the end of the day, it will be very interesting to see whether the potential for job growth is really significant. And the government will have to really focus on that, because that will have an impact on whether we can create a national and private sector consensus and support for such Green New Deal. Now, the new European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, under her leadership, this European Green Deal was announced. And there are 7 focal areas, clean energy being one of them. And also from farm to fork is another area. And there are various strategies that come with these this Green Deal. For example, the chemical strategy was announced in October this year, farm to fork strategy in May this year, the EU biodiversity strategy announced also in May this year, and there was chemical strategy and EU methane strategy. So there are concrete targets for emissions reduction, and that is a key aspect of the European Green Deal. Now, the funding. EU has a budget, so some budget will be carved out of that for this Green Deal, and there's going to be an EU ETS fund that will be created. And in the red box here, I've written just transition mechanism. Green Deal will involve some sacrifice from the industries that had primarily relied on fossil fuels, such as steel making and traditional energy sector, and they will see some, restructuring necessary because the jobs will decrease. So there needs to be more jobs created in the green sector to compensate for that. And European climate law has been submitted in March this year, and they are now deliberating on this legislation. And in order to achieve a net zero emission by 2050, this European climate law has to be passed. Now, United States. In the Digital New Deal, the focus was on creating the infrastructure. But if we look at the campaign pledge for President-elect Biden, there is a significant section dedicated to investing in clean energy. And you can see infrastructure, auto industry, transit, power sector, buildings, housing, innovation, agriculture and conservation, and environmental justice. So all these 9 key areas are areas where there will be significant investment made by the U.S. government. I have now explained the Digital New Deal initiatives by EU, China, and the US, and also the Green New Deal initiatives by the US and EU. So there are different options and different ideas and strategies that have been laid out by these different players. So Korea needs to study these and also learn from them. And we need to choose our own appropriate strategies. And we need to also think about how to get the buy-in and support from the Korean citizens and also the private sector. We really need to find ways to incentivize the different sectors in our economy to voluntarily join in this effort. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
감사합니다, 김규판 박사님.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. And now I'd like to invite the next speaker, Dr. Sang-won Ko from Korea Information Society Development Institute. His presentation title is Digital New Deal and International Cooperation. Good afternoon. As introduced, I am Sang-won Ko from Korea Information Society Development Institute. It is my great pleasure and honor to be here as a speaker. I want to talk about Digital New Deal and international cooperation. This is the content of my presentation, Digitalization and Economic Growth, and Digital ODA from developed countries and multilateral donor organizations, and Korea's digital ODA status and development direction. First, digitalization and economic growth. Professor Robert Gordon is quite famously pessimistic about digitalization, but still many people support the positive impact from digitalization. So the Korean New Deal also wants to transform Korea into a leading country by making investment in digital areas. So a path to the economic growth is going to be improved, as you can see on this slide. And the Digital New Deal investment is mostly in the digital contactless industry development and SOC digitalization. Digital is a major trend. If you look at the number of internet users per 100 people, you can see a big jump across the board around the world, particularly even in African countries. Now it's jumped to over 40 people in just a few years. And the same story is repeated in terms of mobile broadband penetration. Then what about the priority for developing countries to make investment in digital? We can think about two factors, ICT penetration rate and economic growth rate. So this is the relationship between the two. So if you input or add minimum critical threshold, then after that there is a saturation point, and after that the growth rate goes down. This is one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that the broadband network has big impact economically, and you can see the graphs. So this is another hypothesis. So we wanted to verify this hypothesis. So we were able to see that the 1% increase in broadband adoption rate leads to a bigger economic impact in developing countries compared to developed countries. The Digital New Deal emphasizes the digital ecosystem. So the digital input elements and production and digitalization and regulation policy, all these are intertwined, as you can see here. So this ecosystem development coefficient can be measured like this on this slide. Digitalization has definitely an impact on economic growth, but the impact is less than a wireless broadband network, but bigger than fixed line broadband. But overall, digitalization leads to more economic gain. And digital-related projects that can be potential room for international cooperation. So this is an example in Rwanda where a rare blood is being transported by a drone. Then let's take a look at how developed countries and multilateral donor organizations operate digital ODA. These are the major ODA organizations. On the top, you have USAID. They have digital download program. So this is focused on digital development in healthcare, food, finance, digital literacy, and also support for women. DFID is a UK agency. Here, they are focusing on poverty reduction and also dysfunction of digital technology. BMZ is a German initiative, and they pursue Digital Africa initiative that actually provided 100 million of euro in budget to the Digital Africa Initiative. JICA is the Japan International Cooperation Agency. So their ICT sector development strategy is focused on environment establishment, human resource development, and ICT application. AFD is a French aid agency. They really put forward SDG in terms of adopting digital technologies. And they also emphasize open source software and personal data protection as well. SIDA, they were way ahead. They already adopted ICT 4D as a mainstreaming element of ODA in 1999. Now let's look at the ODA strategy, digital ODA strategy by multilateral organizations. First, in the case of EU, EU and the World Bank takes up a majority, above majority share of the ODA around the world. So EU adopted a Digital for Development, D4D, in 2017. Also, they announced a linkage to SDGs. And they also have EU AU Digital Economy Task Force launched in 2018. The World Bank is also working hard for digital dividends, more specifically digital infrastructure, digital finance, digital ID, digital innovation, entrepreneurship, digital literacy, and platform. Korea was also an investor in the World Bank initiative as well, particularly the Digital Development Partnership Fund. And AFDB and ITU are also active in this area. ADB, they try to identify both challenges and opportunities from digital transformation. And this slide shows 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So how can we pursue or achieve SDGs through ICT? Due to the time limit, I'd like to skip a detailed explanation for each goal. But I'd like to draw your attention to goal number 4 and 8. Goal number 4 and 8 is receiving a lot of support. And now I want to talk about Korea's digital ODA status and development direction. So Korea's ODA size is about $250 million. So it's about 0.15% of Korea's GNI. In terms of the absolute amount, Korea's ODA volume is about 1/6 of the Japanese ODA. And compared to Norway and Sweden, Korea falls behind. Here, it shows Korea's ODA size and also GNI portion trend. So here, the ODA, there was a change in the indicator. So it's when we look at this time series data, we need to bear in mind that the indicators are changed. So Korea's ODA is focused on the top 10 donors, for example, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Mongolia, Bangladesh, and other countries written on the slide, as you can see here. In terms of the ODA type, there is a bilateral aid and multilateral aid. Bilateral aid is a majority type in Korea, but core multilateral aid takes up about 24% and followed by earmarked multilateral aid. Now Korea's digital ODA status. So for the general ICT ODA, it takes up about 1.4%. For convergence ICT ODA, it's about 7.8% of the total ODA. And in the case of the convergence ODA, you can see the major sectors here, for example, public administration, education, environment, energy, etc. And recently, entrepreneurship, security, disaster, safety, healthcare area saw an increase in the ODA amount. This is Korea's ODA direction. So for example, Korea is strong in areas such as smart city, healthcare, digital New Deal, and Green New Deal. So actually all these four categories can be considered as a digital ODA. And now if you look at here, EIPP and KSP programs, they can also incorporate digital ODA elements as well. Korea is now operating 13 trust funds at 5 multilateral development banks. And these funds can be utilized for ODA. So as you can see here, under the World Bank, we have Korea WB Cooperation Fund and Green Growth Fund and other funds as enumerated here. And with DB, IDB, AFDB, EBRD, Korea also has these trust funds. And lastly, this is my conclusion. Then how are we going to pursue digital ODA going forward? First, we need to increase the size. So we need to increase digital ODA's portion out of the total Korean ODA. And second, we try to find a way to apply digital technology to overall ODA projects. This is called mainstreaming digital ODA. So we need to mainstream digital ODA. And also, we need to have ring fencing as well. Ring fencing means increasing budget for digital ODA. And also, of course, grant needs to be still used. And grant and existing trust fund needs to be utilized. And also, digital technology can be utilized to respond to COVID-19, of course. And so, in overseas cases, for example, Korea received ODA from other countries such as the US, and that laid foundation for Korea's development. Now it's Korea's turn to help other developing countries. Thank you very much.
네, 발표 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Go. Last but not least, I would like to invite Dr. Chang-hoon Lee, Senior Research Fellow at Korea Environment Institute, who's going to present on the Korean Green New Deal. Good afternoon. I am Chang-hoon Lee. I'm from KEI. It is a great honor to have been invited as a speaker to this session. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Korean Green New Deal. I saw in the news that President Moon will announce the carbon neutrality plan at 7:30 this evening. So I'm going to talk about the Korean New Deal today. And there's been a lot of discussions between two different groups who are pushing for two different focal areas in the Green New Deal, in the Korean New Deal. And I think the President Moon's announcement this evening will show that there's been a lot more narrowing of the difference in opinions in the two groups who are pushing for the Korean New Deal. Again, a New Deal concept was first introduced by the late President Roosevelt. And basically, we always saw New Deal as a government-funded initiative to recover the economy. But if we think about the New Deal that we are seeing these days, there are 3 R's to it. The first aspect is relief. And secondly, there's the aspect of recovery, to go back to the pre-crisis levels, of course. And then there is the third R, which is reform, which is meant to help prevent a future crisis. So I think these 3 R's of a New Deal concept is very important. I mentioned just before there are two groups who had differing views on what a Korean New Deal should be. So let me talk about what differences there are. Even before COVID-19, there was a discussion about the Green New Deal concept in the world. So in the EU, the Green New Deal was announced prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. So there were talks about structural transformation in all sectors to achieve true carbon neutrality. And in January 2019, the Democratic Party in the US submitted the Green New Deal resolution. And they were calling for very meaningful structural transformation in order to achieve carbon neutrality. The Digital New Deal was actually an extension from digital economy or digital transformation. But in the case of Green New Deal, this concept had already existed as a concept of its own prior to COVID-19. And the Green New Deal's aim is to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. And early this year, in Korea, we started to talk about the Green New Deal based on these ideas that have been floated by different countries in the world. And the Democratic Party, the Justice Party, and the Green Party have all contributed to this idea of Green New Deal. But prior to this, leading up to this, of course, there was the Paris Agreement, the IPCC report in 2018, and these highlighted that we need to limit the increase of the global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than pre-crisis, pre-industrial levels. So the international community has been really emphasizing this message to promote meaningful response to climate change. Again, there were two groups and two different approaches to Green New Deal in Korea. So, for example, there are people who knew about the Green New Deal prior to COVID-19, and these were a minority. And there were others who never knew about Green New Deal prior to COVID-19. Most of the politicians and public servants and the general public fall to this latter category. Now, COVID-19 has impacted the economy negatively, so we need to, pursue economic recovery. So while we're at it, let's just try to achieve recovery by making investment in the right sector, in the good sectors, and that would be the green sector. So that was the idea espoused by the Korean government in the plan that was announced in July this year. But then I mentioned the minority of people who already knew about the Green New Deal prior to COVID-19. They knew about the Green New Deal concept put forth by EU and the US, but most other people see Green New Deal as being espoused by the Korean government in the plan that was announced in July this year. But now there are talks about sort of merging this Digital New Deal and Green New Deal, and that was the President Moon's recommendation. And based on that, we are now seeing the Korean Green New Deal, which was announced in June. So the first area of that is to turn green city and space and living infrastructure. And also, the second area is to building the ecosystem for green industries. And thirdly, to expand the low-carbon energy production. And the comprehensive planning was started to make Korean New Deal implementable. A number of important elements should be noted. According to the July 14th plan, it does put in carbon neutrality as an important goal, but they did not specify a deadline. There was a lot of, controversy because people were saying without a deadline, this carbon neutrality goal means nothing. Are we trying to achieve carbon neutrality by 2070 or 2100? And so this criticism was raised by some politicians in the Democratic Party, as well as environmental NGOs. But at the same time, the government responded that because we're not fully ready, it's very difficult for us to put a deadline on it. So only the goal was announced without a deadline. But our comprehensive plan in July was a little bit more advanced, more developed than the one announced in June. There were some mentions of institutional changes that would need to be made, and also it defined what mechanisms or what forums would be created in order to push forth this plan. And also there were modifications in the actual projects and initiatives that would make up the Green New Deal. In the EU and American Green New Deal, it doesn't just focus on carbon neutrality. It talks about cyclical, circulatory economy. It talks about biodiversity. So it's really comprehensively deals with a lot of environmental issues. And so our Green New Deal comprehensive plan in July also included, water-related issues, biodiversity, and also green financing and fair transition. So in that sense, it's a little bit more developed than our plan in June. But it still is primarily focused on allocating budgets to specific investment opportunities and projects. But if in order for us to really achieve a huge transition and transformation, it's not enough to have government-funded projects in place. We really need voluntary participation by the private sector, and in that sense, this plan is a little bit limited. In September, the UN Climate Summit, Xi Jinping announced that we will be aiming for carbon neutrality by 2060. And we will be hitting carbon peak by 2030. And this was a shocking news. In order for us to limit our increase in temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, IPCC requires that net CO2 emissions should be zero by 2050. That means the developed economies need to achieve net zero by 2040. And India, China, these developing countries, if they want more time, of course, the developed nations would have to achieve the net emissions earlier. And so, in that sense, China had really proactively made the carbon neutrality announcement. And Japan's Prime Minister, when he was sworn in October, he announced the carbon neutrality goal by 2050. So because of this landscape and how other countries were announcing goals, Korea could not be left out, and sort of the deadline had to be set. And the carbon neutrality plan was once again announced, and we would have a 2050 carbon neutrality committee installed under the president's office, and a vice minister for energy would be appointed, and we would create a special fund on climate change response, and we would reform the taxes and levies to help finance the climate change response. And this carbon neutrality 2050 goal is not binding. It's a declaration, but it's not binding. But what is more binding is 2030 NDCs. In the case of Korea, we had announced that we would limit our CO2 emissions to 536 million tons by 2030. And our original NDC in the US, the EU's original NDC was to reduce 40%, but later on this was raised to over 50%. Biden's aim is to raise the NDCs for 2030 across the world. So it's not just the US. So Biden wants to have the leaders of key economies so that each major economic players in the world would commit to a higher level of NDC for 2030. Now, there were differences in opinions, as I mentioned, with regards to Korean New Deal. And again, over the course of the year, with these international announcements and movements in other countries, we're sort of coming to a narrower difference in opinion. The Korean government is going to develop a scenario for achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. So this is not really a plan, but they want to develop different scenarios, taking into consideration various technologies that will be available and based on different sociological changes that might happen. So these scenarios will be developed. And based on those scenarios, a plan or strategy will be created as to what kind of efforts need to be in place for the power generation sector or the transportation sector, building, and different industries. So these need to be developed further. And all of these are not just a national initiative. We cannot do this alone. Our emission accounts for 1.5 to 2% of the global emission. So we need to work on our own, but also we need to have other countries also making a lot of effort, developing technologies that will make carbon emissions reduction possible. And so in that sense, international cooperation is very, very important. Secondly, to stimulate the economy, we only needed to provide investment in the form of government subsidies and grants and whatnot. But this is different. We need to transform the entire society, the economic structure and whatnot, and this needs private sector involvement. We talk about green remodeling, and that can be achieved to a certain extent by getting, giving subsidies or grants. But it is more important to introduce restrictions or regulations rather to limit the emissions by new buildings that are built. Right now, steel and cement, they are actually emitting quite a lot. And, they're not just emitting because they need to generate power, but they're using the carbon as raw material. And in that case, it's very difficult to reduce emissions. If we are able to reduce our use of plastic by half, we would be able to reduce emissions by half. So we really need to reduce our consumption. And also we need to think about how to collaborate effectively with the workers in the different industries, in the different regions. So it has to be a society-wide partnership that needs to be in place in order for us to achieve carbon neutrality. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We had very good presentations from the three speakers. Now I would like to invite Dr. Samyeol Lee, Dr. Sunjin Yoon, and Dr. Boin Lee to carry out a panel discussion. So I would like to invite those three panelists and also the three presenters to come up to the stage.
안녕하십니까.
Good afternoon. I'm going to moderate this panel discussion. I am Ho-yeol Kwon. So before we start the discussion, we already listened to the presentations. I'd like to refresh introduction of them. So to my immediate left, we have Senior Research Fellow Kyupan Kim from Kiev. He talked about Korean New Deal and other countries' policies. Please refrain from uploading until the end of the introduction. And then we have Mr. Sangwon Go, who talked about Digital New Deal and international cooperation. And just now we listened to senior researcher Chang-Hoon Lee about the Korean Green New Deal.
이어서
Next, we have with us Professor Samyeol Lee from Yonsei University. He is one of our 3 panelists. And we have with us Professor Sun-Jin Yoon from Seoul National University's Environmental Studies Graduate School. And finally, we have with us Mr. Bo-in Lee, who's a team leader from the Ministry of Finance Task Force for Korean New Deal.
이렇게 해서 모두
So I've introduced them all briefly. Now we are going to start the discussion. So we've listened to 3 presentations, and I'd like to ask the designated discussant to give your questions or comments to the presentations. We are going to start with Professor Samyeol Lee, followed by Professor Sun-Jin Yoon and team leader Bo-in Lee. Professor Lee, would you start? Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for all your 3 presentations. It was wonderful. And Dr. Ko talked about the overall digital ODA and also Korean New Deal and overseas cases as well. So it was very interesting for me. And the session, I can see that 2 big themes in this session. One is digital ODA, the other is Green New Deal. I am more experienced in the digital area, so my comment is based on that. In order for us to implement ODA programs, we end up visiting a lot of developing countries. And I really feel that still we need to improve their access to digital technologies. So once you step outside a main capital city area, then there's hardly any access to digital technology in many developing countries. And also many adults often use smartphones. And also digital access is mostly lacking among young children and young students. And paradoxically, these young people can benefit most by utilizing digital technology, but they don't have enough access to digital technology. So these are some observations from my personal experiences. And broadband, we think that because we have a broadband ODA, there's a broadband, we think we can reduce our digital ODA. But that doesn't, just because a given country has commercial broadband, it doesn't mean that there is a widespread access to that broadband network. So broadband and universal access, those 2 concepts need to go together. So basically, we need to think about how to implement universal access to the broadband network in developing countries, and how can we link that to our ODA programs. So in a nutshell, this includes training programs as well. So in order for people to access digital technology, they need to be taught to utilize these technologies as well. Then, when ODA projects are implemented in various developing countries, we can think about ODA program at the level of device, at the level of digital infrastructure, at the level of education. So ODA can be much more impactful. And digital infrastructure as well. When we think about the donor countries' bureaucrats, government officials, we also need to think about their capacity as well. I think that is very important to increase the capacity of the government officials of the recipient country. We often offer 1 week or 2 week training sessions, but that is not enough to really bring about a change in their mindset. So we need to offer something much more mid and long-term education. And also, this kind of education cannot be limited just to government officials. We need to broaden the target audience of education opportunities to include the general public. So the general public needs to be convinced of the benefit of digital technology. So we need to have mid to long-term perspective when we plan and execute digital ODA. And recently, we've been working hard to provide educational opportunities to government officials. But I think we also need to think more about the younger generation, students and people who just graduate schools, who are just entering the workforce. With the spread of COVID-19, I believe that this is time for countries to open up their policies. For example, in the past, it was not easy to pursue online education programs. But now at KOICA, we have an online training education program targeting Southeast Asian students for master's degree. This program is already ongoing, and many students from Southeast Asian countries, although they stay in their home country, they log in and participate in this online master's degree course. So when this window of opportunity is open, it can actually lead to further widening of a gap between countries. For example, certain countries, they move immediately to wireless technology without utilizing fixed line network. So, for example, we can share our success proven programs and experiences with our recipient countries. And lastly, knowledge ODA and also grant. I think that was mentioned during the presentation as well. These things on field are better to take place simultaneously. So I hope that when an ODA program is implemented, knowledge ODA and grant, they need to be planned simultaneously. In certain cases, participants in one program are excluded from applying for the other types of ODA. And I don't think that is a good idea. I hope it can be more open between different types of ODA. And also, I personally, it is kind of regrettable that during the early stage of the current government, there was not much active discussion and planning about these types of ODAs. But still, I'm very glad to see that kind of discussion and planning happening right now. And I hope that the private sector experts will not be excluded from this discussion and this process going forward. Thank you very much.
감사합니다. 이삼열 교수님께서
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Please give a big hand. So he talked about how we need the infrastructure, equipment, program, and education and training need to be provided as a package in order for the ODA to be more effective. And he talked about how knowledge transfer and a loan should maybe go hand in hand together. And I think that should be taken into account. Professor Samuel Lee, do you have any questions for Dr. Ko? If not, then I would like to ask a question.
디지털 오디
So you talked about the future direction for Korea's Digital New Deal. You talked about the 5 points, and you talked about policy that's more friendly to the recipient country's ecosystem. Usually, recipient countries has very low level of personal income, less than $5,000. So they don't actually have much infrastructure in reality. So Professor Lee just talked about access. So maybe KOICA needs to have a program for KOICA actually had a program to broaden access, but still there's a lot of limitation just because the recipient countries have limited infrastructure and limited budget. Of course, preferably our ODA needs to be more tailored to the recipient country's ecosystem, but the ecosystem itself is not much present in donor country. That is actually a great point. Recently, digital is a big buzzword among developing countries. I think that's thanks to the widespread adoption of mobile phones. Even in Africa, mobile phones are being adopted rapidly, about 50% of adoption rate. And also, there's something called the mobile phone lady. It means that you have your own personal mobile phone, but you loan it to others for fee. So mobile, I think we need to go kind of mobile oriented when we provide ODA to emerge developing countries. And this kind of access, building as access, is about both network and device. So we need to boost up both elements. Otherwise, people cannot actually utilize the digital technology. So yes, so for ecosystem-friendly approach, we need to boost up both elements, the network and device. And I read some newspaper articles about AI programs, even in Africa. So Africa is not, yes, Africa is relatively behind us, but still Africa can catch up with us much faster than expected.
또 개인
Thank you very much. I spent 2 years in Ethiopia. I was the president of the Addis Ababa University, and I saw students using mobile phones. Actually, mobile phones in their case is 2G phones, and very few could actually use a smartphone. And as Dr. Ko mentioned, I mean, we should take into account what Dr. Ko said. I mean, we used to rely mostly on text messaging. Now we have more advanced technologies. And so I think we could help these economies be able to access richer contents by helping them with their developments. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal approaches in Korea, and Dr. Chang-hoon Lee mentioned that it is really necessary to have international cooperation in that regard. So perhaps Professor Sun-jin Yoon could comment on this because she has been doing a lot of research on this. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Sun-jin Yoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very meaningful gathering. As Dr. Lee mentioned, President Moon will be announcing the 2050 carbon neutrality goal. Well, this announcement, I believe, is meant as a signal to the Korean people of our direction forward. And on the other hand, it is also a signal towards other countries, letting them know that Korea is aligning itself to the global move towards carbon neutrality. Climate Action Tracker is an international organization. And also there is German Watch. And German Watch each year announces climate change landscape indicator. And worldwide, there are countries that account for more than 1%, of emissions. And it looks at how effectively these countries are responding to climate change. Korea accounts for about 1.8% of global emissions. Therefore, we are also included in that German Watch's indicator study. And so they actually rank from number 4 to 61 because there are no countries who are doing very well. In a couple of years back, we were ranked 58, and we are still in the red group of countries that are not effectively responding because we now remain at rank 53. And so President Moon is going to announce the carbon neutrality goal this evening, and the Korean Green New Deal would be our way forward towards that goal. I think that is a meaningful step forward. Dr. Chang-hoon Lee mentioned that there are two different perspectives in understanding the Korean New Deal. And I think that I can concur with that. And historically, we have actually borrowed the term New Deal from that historical New Deal from way back. So we cannot, erase that historical significance from this New Deal concept. So there is that aspect of trying to stimulate the economy. But of course, we need to steer the New Deal so that it can lead to social reform. Green New Deal. Well, let me go back to the New Deal about in the United States. That was about embracing the workers and ensuring the right of the workers to labor and more proactively, perhaps, to provide some sort of social security. So that was the New Deal originally in the United States. So the relief aspect was key to that New Deal, and then there was element of reform as well. Now, the Korean New Deal that we're pursuing is, of course, has become an important social agenda this year on the back of the challenging situation caused by COVID-19. And so, given that the economic challenges were at the background of this initiative, it is very hard to simply do away with the economic stimulus aspect of it. So we need to focus on that as well. But I think progressively we would need to weigh in on the reform and social transformation aspect of it. So we need to perhaps begin with this initial project to boost the economy, but we would have to expand it with other projects and initiatives to, make it more transformative. And this is an important initiative that can lead to a paradigmatic shift in Korea. And I think it's a social contract towards a greener economy. And Green New Deal should foster should be fostered because it can have significant contributions to responding to the climate change. And so the goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 should be an important part of the Green New Deal. And I think Green New Deal should not be the only initiative to foster the activities towards 2050 carbon neutrality. Digital New Deal should also have that carbon neutrality in mind. So all aspects of the Green New Deal and the Digital New Deal should be designed with the carbon neutrality goal in mind. Again, we're trying to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We need to keep that in mind at all times, even as we try to promote the local economy. The basic premise or goal of the Green New Deal is 2050 carbon neutrality, and any economic stimulus or projects under the Green New Deal should always keep in mind that top goal. And there is this planning committee which are actually hosting different regional meetings, inviting stakeholders to discuss how to pursue the regional new deals, combining both the Green New Deal and Digital New Deal approaches. The core element of Green New Deal is to have energy transformation. Fossil fuels use is at the heart of the problem. Of course, it's not the only problem, only cause of the problem. And so, as Dr. Lee mentioned, energy transformation or energy transition should be at the heart of it, but it is not sufficient. So we need to complement this by incorporating waste issues, agricultural issues, and ecosystem issues, and efforts to solve these issues. And I especially would like to emphasize the agricultural issues because climate crisis really has a detrimental impact on food security. Therefore, we really need to look into how we can sustainably promote agriculture. Depending on what kind of diet we maintain, that has actually an implication for the climate crisis as well. And also wastes. We're seeing explosive growth in wastes, and also these plastics are increasing significantly. And these are all linked back to the climate crisis. They don't decompose, and they also emit. And in order for the Green New Deal to be successful, we need to have laws, institutions, and systems in place. In the National Assembly regular session, I heard that no bill on energy transition was tabled, and I think that is very disheartening to hear. Right now, the Decarbonization Act was submitted, and that should form the basis for a Green New Deal in Korea. And also, there are many workers who had relied on, fossil fuels related industries such as coal-fired power generation. And so these areas and these sectors and the people may be sidelined as we focus our energy on Green New Deal. So we really need to address the economic challenges that these sectors and the workers in these sectors face. So there was this act to support these people. But these bills, unless they are passed and are given legislative status, it would be very difficult to have effective implementation of the Green New Deal because it would lack legislative basis for any activity, any meaningful activities. And we need to have legislations accompany the New Deal. And across the world, including Canada, there are 7 countries that have actually legislated the 2050 carbon neutrality goal so that it's a binding goal. And I think we need to do something similar by achieving, I think pursuing Green New Deal requires legislative and administrative means, and also we need to think about accountability and responsibility. And in connection to this, we need to look at our tax system and also the tariff system, the utility pricing. Do we actually have the right systems in place to promote Green New Deal? We need to ask ourselves that. So the policies, systems, and laws had been planned during the more carbon-emitting society. Now we need to have a grand transformation to bring about a meaningful change towards carbon neutrality. In other countries, oftentimes political ideologies have a great impact on the perception about climate change problem. But interestingly enough, in Korea, political ideologies do not divide people on the issue of climate crisis. But the thing is, although people are widely accepting of this widely recognizing the problem of climate crisis, few people are ready to act in response to climate crisis, and people are not readily accepting of the kind of cost that goes into responding to the crisis. And I think a nuclear power issue is at the heart of this. There are scholars or politicians or citizens who support nuclear power generation because it's considered low carbon emission. But we really need to look at this from a multiple perspective because it has significant implications for the whole power grid. So we also need to look into how we're going to deal with the existing coal-fired power plants. So there are many problems that we need to solve, but none of them can be solved all at once. So we need to take time. We need to engage in dialogue and develop a consensus in our society. Thank you very much.
윤 교수.
Thank you very much. Professor Yoon, do you have any question to Dr. Lee's presentation?
제가 궁금한 게 있어서 질문을 드립니다.
So I actually have a question for Dr. Lee. Professor Yoon has given an extensive discussion just now, and in order to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, we would need, dramatic change in our society. Huge cost will be involved. We need to prepare a lot. And Dr. Lee, you said towards the end of your presentation you mentioned we need to systematically prepare for carbon neutrality, and this would include developing a variety of scenarios and also setting strategies for various sectors. So, and you mentioned that sectors, power generation, building, industries. So if you could maybe prioritize these sectors, what would be your priority? Or which would be the lower hanging fruit? And which area would seem to be too challenging and not ready? I think the easiest area to start would be the transportation sector, because already there are significant carbon neutral technologies such as electrical vehicles and hydrogen vehicle technologies. So, of course, in order to do EV and hydrogen vehicles, we would, of course, have to generate electricity from low carbon technologies. But still, I think technology-wise, this is where greatest advancement has already been made. And the most difficult sector would be, of course, the industries. Steel, petrochemical, and cement, these are areas where it is very difficult to reduce emission. When we are using the carbon as a source of fuel, this can be replaced by renewable energies. But in steels, we need cokes, and the coal is used, only 40% of the coal is used as energy source, but 60% of the coal used in steel making industry is in the actual the process of making steel. So we need to get rid of the oxygen, and in order to do so, carbon from the coal is inputted so that CO2 is emitted in the process. And so it's very difficult to reduce this. So there are people researching, trying to use hydrogen instead of carbon in this process, but this is very technologically advanced, very difficult to utilize and commercialize, because this is just being done in the lab environment right now. So in the petrochemical industry, there is naphtha and ethylene is produced. And in breaking up naphtha or cracking naphtha, CO2 and extreme heat is necessary. And also in the case of cement, there is carbon. And so in order to separate that, the CO2 is emitted. So during the actual process of making the products in these industries, there are a lot of emissions. And we need a lot of international cooperation. Biden is emphasizing international cooperation in technological advancement towards low carbon. So I think we could potentially benefit from such a cooperation. As I was listening, given the nature of the manufacturing process, I can see that there are CO2 emissions, so we do need technological solutions for those problems, I guess. Now, I would like to ask Mr. Lee to deliver his discussions.
기재부가 끌고 가야
So I believe that the Ministry of Strategy and Finance is actually leading the New Deal policy, and team leader Lee is actually a working level team leader who's really heavily involved in this area. As introduced, I am Boin Lee from the Ministry of Strategy and Finance. I'm from a working level support team. So my team is under the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, but actually my division, my team is kind of pan-government team. because we believe that this is not just about Ministry of Strategy and Finance. It is about mobilizing pan-governmental capacity. I thank all the presenters for their wonderful presentations. It was a great learning experience. And Dr. Lee Kim talked about overseas cases and also Digital New Deal and international cooperation. Dr. Go talked about the two pillars, Digital Green Deal, Digital New Deal, and the Green New Deal. And that's actually what the Korean New Deal is about. And execution power is also important. The Korean version New Deal, well, this could be a double-edged sword. So there are some specific business ideas. So in terms of the execution powers, I believe we have what we need, but we still need to improve the institutional framework, for example, better regulation to facilitate these programs. So that's what we are pursuing at my team. And also Dr. Ko talked about the ODA in the area of digital technology. We hope to increase not just Korea's capacity, but other countries' capacity as well. And Dr. Lee talked about Korean Green New Deal, and he also talked about the background and also the progress so far. So that was actually very comprehensive overview for me. So thank you very much. So, and also you mentioned that private sector investment is necessary. So government, public sector investment alone cannot do it all. So we need private sector investment, and we are well aware of that. So we need to invite more investment from the private sector. We are now thinking hard about how to do that. For example, in September, we announced a Korean New Deal Fund, and it's open to public to participate. So that's one of our efforts to promote private sector participation. And also, we have a task force to work on legal and the regulatory framework. So this task force is composed of government officials and also non-public experts as well, and the party as well. And also the ruling party also identified 10 legislation tasks. So, for example, Green New Deal Basic Act and Energy Conversion Support Act. And of course, it has been quite slow because it takes time for these bill proposals to go through the National Assembly and also to coordinate opinions. So it's going slow, but it's happening. And also the background as to why Green New Deal, Korean Green New Deal came about. If I can touch upon that briefly. COVID-19 is hitting the entire world, not just Korea. And some people are even comparing this to the Great Depression. So back in the time of Great Depression, the U.S. pursued New Deal policy to overcome the Great Depression. So that is how we came up with this idea of Korean New Deal to overcome the impact from COVID-19. But we want to emphasize the green element of the policy. Of course, COVID-19 and its impact is really tremendous. So people are wondering about how we can recover from this and what should be the right path back to our economic growth. So we think that of course, we need a stimulus policy, but also we need to think about some structural response as well. Structural changes, for example, structural changes that are coming to us. So we want to be proactive to address those structural changes. So, for example, digital conversion, digital transformation, and also EU also announced its own Green New Deal. But the difference is that COVID-19 accelerated just everything. So I think that's a major new factor. So for the Korean government as well, to be more proactive in dealing with these new structural changes happening around the world, the Korean government came up with a Green New Deal, and COVID-19 accelerated that pace. And we also have a policy put together with the input from the ruling party as well. And so this is how we are pursuing the Korean New Deal. My last comment is that in July, the Korean New Deal was publicly announced, and the Korean New Deal is going to evolve. So there's not going to be just one fixed version of Korean New Deal, and it's going to stay that way. No, Korean New Deal is going to evolve because we are going to incorporate feedback from various sectors and experts. So thank you very much.
전반적인 한국판 뉴딜이
Mr. Lee added some comments about how this New Deal came about. Do you have any questions for the presenters? It appears that I'm the only one asking questions. I would like to ask a question to Dr. Kyupan Kim then. Dr. Kim, you have outlined many different examples, and if we look at the EU's New Deal, shaping Europe's digital future project, for example, it's not really aiming to, make the world a happier place for everyone. It's actually, striving to make Europe, competitive, probably because the crisis that they're facing is so difficult to recover from. And there are three pillars. One is digital technology, the other is digital economy, and the third pillar seems to be society. Of course, AI, 5G, telecommunication, and education and human resource development is also mentioned. And in order to revive the economy, there needs to be a lot of startup activities. And in order to make a sustainable society, there needs to be this green transition. I think that's all outlined in that digital strategy. So I think these are very meaningful. Digital technology, digital economy, digital society. So these three pillars seem to be quite meaningful. In the case of Korean New Deal, we have, on the one hand, digital New Deal, and there is the Green New Deal, and also strengthening of the social safety net. So these are the key pillars on which the Korean New Deal is built. Of course, we're not as categorized in our approach as EU is, but Dr. Kim, you talked about the three pillars of the European strategy. How do you think, such pillars could maybe be relevant for the Korean New Deal? Well, I do not have a very in-depth understanding of the Korean Digital New Deal. So just based on my rough knowledge of the Digital New Deal, the Korean government's version of the Digital New Deal seems to be pretty much focused on the online and remotely delivered digital services in order to recover the economy from COVID-19. So compared to the EU's three-pillar approach, the Korean Digital New Deal seems to be narrower in scope. And COVID-19 seemed like it was going to be controlled, and then it picked up again in Korea. So right now, there is a greater focus on the digital industries. And so in this environment, I don't think there will be a significant hurdle blocking a government effort to foster these industries. But in order for us to expand this to a broader scope, to the one we're seeing in Europe, we need to, we should not just focus on technology. We should have a more comprehensive approach. Of course, because this is about digital, technological advancement and investing in it is important. But in order for this to be more widely meaningful, there has to be a sound market for this. And in order for us to have this not as just an economic stimulus, but have a far-reaching societal impact, we really need to sort of have a package, the kind that EU has put forth. But it's creating packages of policies or strategies. It's not as easy. It's easy to say, but it's very difficult to achieve because there are different ministries who are given specific mandates and who want to have that specific domain in which they have control. And so in order for the digital New Deal in Korea to become a widely impactful New Deal, we need sort of a whole of government approach rather than a siloed approach. And I think that's something that we need to learn from the EU's case. I also agree to what you just mentioned. In pursuing digital New Deal, of course, we need to foster the different technologies, but at the same time, we need to have the public-private cooperation and a governance that would involve both. And we need more whole-of-government approach. We need to have green economy, green society, and green technology that can be developed through more broad approach. Maybe initially we were not ready to incorporate all of these different elements into this New Deal plan, but over the course of time, I think we could potentially expand so that ultimately we could achieve a meaningful social transformation. And further to that, maybe a success case in this endeavor could also help us share our experiences with other countries in the future. I think we have come to the end of this session. I would like to thank the presenters and the panelists, as well as the participants and viewers who've been watching through YouTube. Thank you very much for your participation. We have looked at the new deals across the world and took some insights that can be beneficial for Korea. COVID-19 has posed great challenges for us, but perhaps we could turn those challenges into opportunities. And the insights that we shared today can be viewed later on through our channels. And I think that's great that we're able to have that available for you. And I hope that we can have meaningful international cooperation so that our new deals can be very fruitful. Thank you very much for your participation.